It's a Tuesday evening in 1957, and the television has gone wrong. Not completely wrong, the sound is still there, and you can almost hear Ed Sullivan introducing the next act. But the picture has collapsed into a thin, white horizontal line across the middle of the screen, and no amount of adjusting the vertical hold knob on the side of the cabinet is making it come back. The mother calls a number written on a card near the telephone. The next morning, a man arrives at the front door with a heavy black case in one hand and a portable tube tester under his arm. He sets them down on the floor in front of the console, takes off his jacket, folds it neatly over the arm of the sofa, and opens the back of the television the way a doctor opens a medical bag, with the confidence of someone who has done this 10,000 times and is not even slightly concerned. He pulls a tube, tests it, replaces it. He makes two more swaps. He flips the set back on. The picture blooms back onto the screen, sharp and clear. He writes out a bill for $4.75, puts his jacket back on, picks up his case, and is gone before the coffee finishes brewing. This is the story of who that man was, how an entire industry built itself around him, and the quiet revolution in engineering that made him as extinct as the tubes he used to carry. Tell me in the comments, do you remember the TV Repairman coming to your house? If you grew up in that era, the television wasn't just something you watched, it was something you could feel. You remember the warmth that came off the back of the cabinet when the set had been on for a while. The specific, slightly sweet, slightly electrical heat of 20-odd vacuum tubes running at temperature inside a wooden box. You remember the cardboard ventilation panel on the back, full of small holes, there specifically to let that heat escape so it didn't build up and destroy the very components generating it. You remember the tubes themselves if you were ever allowed near the back of the set. Glass bottles of different sizes, some cylindrical, some more bulbous, each one glowing a faint orange gold in the dark interior of the cabinet. You could watch them warm up from a cold start, the glow brightening slowly over the first 30 seconds as the set came to life, which is why early televisions took a full minute or two to show a picture after you switched them on. The television was a living thing in that sense. It glowed, it warmed, it occasionally smelled of heat. And it broke regularly and predictably in ways that a skilled man with a case full of spare parts could fix in an hour. Here is the detail that explains everything else in this story. The television of the 1950s was not just expected to break, it was designed to be fixed. TV sets in that era put enormous stress on vacuum tubes, and failure rates were genuinely high. Service trucks were a common sight in American neighborhoods throughout the entire decade. Manufacturers knew this, accepted it, and built their products accordingly. The line cord was mounted in the back cover in a way that allowed it to be easily disconnected. The replaceable tubes were separated from the high-voltage areas of the chassis so a technician could work on them without navigating around lethal components. Every tube socket was accessible. Every connection was serviceable. RCA, Zenith, and the other major manufacturers held annual service meetings for independent repair technicians, whining and dining them, walking them through the new models year by year, showing them what had changed and what to look for. The repairman was not an afterthought in the television ecosystem. He was a planned, supported, essential part of it. The television industry built a product that needed fixing, and then built an entire skilled profession around the fixing of it. The brilliance of the vacuum tube and the fact that made the repair culture genuinely democratic was that a failed tube was visible. If a device didn't work correctly, the problem tube was simply not glowing, while the remaining tubes were. You could see the failure with your eyes. You removed the dark tube, carried it down to the corner, and tested it yourself. Because tube testers weren't just in repair shops. They were everywhere, bolted to counters at gas stations, hardware stores, grocery stores, and drugstores across the country, available for any customer to use for free. You brought your suspected tube, pushed it into the appropriate socket on the tester, read the needle, and knew within 30 seconds whether the tube had failed. If it had, you bought a replacement from the same counter, typically $2 to $4, carried it home, plugged it in, and in many cases, the television was working again before the repairman ever needed to be called. You have heard of 10-year-olds fixing the family television. This is how. That attitude, repair is normal, repair is possible, repair is expected, was simply part of how the era worked. For problems beyond a simple tube swap, there was the repairman himself, and he was a fixture of the neighborhood in a way that has almost entirely disappeared from American life. He usually operated out of a small shop on a local commercial strip. Radio and TV repair, the sign said, with maybe the owner's name above it. The window displaying a few sets in various states of disassembly. He knew his territory the way a doctor knew his patients, the families on each block, the sets they owned, the recurring problems of specific models. He came to your house with a heavy case containing a portable tube tester, a selection of the most commonly needed replacement tubes, and the basic tools of his trade. The repair was done in your living room, on your carpet, in front of you. There was no dropping the set off somewhere and waiting a week. The television was the size of a piece of furniture. A genuine console set weighed over 100 pounds, and nobody was taking it anywhere. The repairman came to the set, not the other way around. The repairman wasn't the only tool in the household arsenal, of course. Every family developed its own personal relationship with the quirks of its specific television, and chief among the folk remedies of the era was the percussive adjustment. The firm, open palm smack on the top or side of the cabinet that would, with reasonable reliability, cause a loose tube to reseat itself in its socket and the picture to snap back into coherence. Andy Kaufman, the comedian, famously included a few seconds of deliberate vertical roll in a comedy special, hoping, he said, to get all of America to rise as one and smack their televisions simultaneously. The gag worked precisely because everyone in his audience had done exactly that. There was also the vertical hold knob, the horizontal hold, the fine-tuning ring around the channel selector, and the brightness and contrast controls. A full set of physical adjustments any member of the family was expected to manage personally before calling the repairman. The television required engagement. It was not a passive appliance. By the mid-1950s, television repair had become a genuine profession, with its own trade publications, its own industry associations, and its own career ladder from apprentice to master technician. Correspondence schools advertised in the back pages of magazines, promising readers they could learn television repair at home and build a stable, respectable career. Young men who hung around repair shops, sweeping floors and watching the technicians work could learn a real and marketable skill without ever attending a formal institution. The profession rewarded curiosity, pattern recognition, and patience, the same qualities that would, a generation later, attract a different kind of young man to computers. Major manufacturers treated their service networks seriously. RCA and Zenith held those annual meetings, wined and dined their independent technicians, and kept them current on new model specifications. The relationship between manufacturer and repairman was understood by both sides as genuinely symbiotic. The repairman kept the customer's investment working and the manufacturer's reputation intact long after the sale. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the arrival of color television complicated the repairman's life considerably and raised the stakes of every service call. A black and white television stored about 17,000 volts in the capacitance of its picture tube. A color television used 33,000. With those voltages present inside a home consumer product, the warnings about safe servicing became considerably more serious. The government established guidelines on how close a viewer should sit to a color television set, partly because some early picture tubes didn't carry adequate lead shielding from the soft X-rays the high-voltage components produced. Color sets also contained more tubes, more components to fail, more variables to diagnose, more skills required of the repairman. The annual service meetings manufacturers held became more important, not less, as the complexity of the sets increased. But color also meant the sets were more expensive to buy, which meant families were more motivated to repair them rather than replace them when something went wrong. A $400 color console in 1965 was not something a family discarded because a tube had failed. You called the repairman and you waited. The first serious threat to the repair economy didn't come from outside the industry. It came from inside it in the form of a small, solid sliver of semiconductor called the transistor. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, transistors steadily replaced vacuum tubes in consumer electronics. They were smaller, cooler running, more reliable, and drew far less power. Where a vacuum tube might need replacement every 2 to 3 years under normal use, a transistor could run for decades without failing. The tube manufacturers fought back with innovation. General Electric introduced the compactron in 1961, packing multiple tube functions into a single envelope to reduce component count. RCA developed the Nuvistor, a tiny metal-clad tube that tried to match transistor dimensions while retaining tube performance. But the economics of the transistor were becoming overwhelming, and the consumer electronics industry followed them. For the repairman, the transistor brought a paradox. The sets became more reliable, which meant fewer service calls, but when transistorized sets did fail, the failure was harder to diagnose by eye. A dead transistor did not glow or not glow. It simply didn't work, with no visible sign to guide you to the problem. The transistor made repair harder. The Japanese-made television set made it pointless. Beginning in the late 1960s and accelerating through the 1970s, Japanese manufacturers, Sony, Panasonic, Sharp, Hitachi, entered the American market with solid-state television sets built on integrated circuits, manufactured to tolerances and price points that American manufacturers struggled to match. These sets were cheaper to buy new than American-made equivalents and more reliable in operation. They were also, from the repairman's point of view, a professional catastrophe. Unlike the American manufacturers who had trained and supported their service networks, Japanese brands arrived with no factory support infrastructure for independent American technicians, no service meetings, no parts pipelines, no training materials. As one veteran technician with 60 years in the trade would later put it, Japanese and other Far East brands started invading the market with no factory support, and American manufacturers went out of business one by one. Without parts availability and factory support, repairing a Japanese set became difficult, and increasingly the economics of repair no longer made sense anyway. A new Sony costs less than an American set had cost new, and less still than repairing an aging American one. Somewhere in the 1970s, a new calculation entered the American household, one that would, over the following decade, end the repair economy for consumer electronics entirely. It went like this. The television is broken. A repairman charges $80 to diagnose and repair it. A new set with better features and a warranty costs $120. The old set, once repaired, will likely need service again within 2 years. The new set will not. This calculation, run by millions of families across the country, produced the same conclusion every time, and the conclusion had nothing to do with the repairman's skill or the quality of his work. It was purely arithmetic. The arithmetic of a market in which manufacturing costs had fallen faster than labor costs, and in which a new product was simply cheaper per year of reliable use than maintaining an old one. The repairman hadn't done anything wrong. The economics had shifted around him exactly the way they had shifted around the milkman, around the cobbler, around the watch repairman. The same story, told again in a different trade. The decline of the neighborhood TV repair shop followed the same pattern as most of the other disappearances in the series. Not a single catastrophic moment, but a long, quiet series of closures, each individually unremarkable. One veteran who had spent 60 years in the trade watched the number of TV repair shops in the Denver area go from dozens to maybe 3 or 4, and remembered it as a slow, dispiriting withdrawal rather than a sudden collapse. The shops that survived did so by diversifying, repairing VCRs, then computers, then audio equipment, then anything with a circuit board and a power supply, following the work wherever it still existed. Parts became the central problem. As flat-screen LCD and plasma sets replaced the last of the tube-based sets, manufacturers stopped making replacement components available for older models. Without parts, a repairman willing to do the work had nothing to work with.
A 77-year-old technician who had spent his entire adult life in the trade would later say simply that the only trade he had ever known had basically ceased to exist. The arrival of flat-screen LCD and plasma televisions in the late 1990s and early 2000s completed what the transistor and the Japanese manufacturers had started. It made television repair not just economically irrational, but physically impossible for most households. A flat-screen television has no user-serviceable components. There are no tubes to pull and test, no sockets to reseat, no knobs to adjust. When the backlight fails or the display panel develops a crack, or the mainboard stops functioning, the repair requires not a portable tube tester and a case of spares, but a soldering station, specialty diagnostic equipment, and components that the manufacturer often declined to make available at all. Parts are basically not available, as most manufacturers do not give a moment's concern whether their product gets repaired. A flat-screen television that fails is, in the vast majority of cases, simply discarded, carried to the curb, hauled to an electronics recycling center, or left in a dumpster behind an apartment building. The notion of a repairman coming to your living room to fix it is as conceptually remote as a blacksmith.
Here is the argument buried inside of all of this that most people never think to make. The repairability of the 1950s television was not an accident of the technology. It was a design philosophy. Vacuum tubes were made replaceable because manufacturers expected them to fail and expected customers to replace them, either themselves, at the drugstore tube tester, or through the service network. The ventilation holes in the back panel were there because keeping the set cool extended tube life. The accessible chassis, the separated high-voltage sections, the annual service training meetings, all of it reflected a manufacturer's explicit acknowledgement that the customer's relationship with the product extended past the sale, and that the manufacturer had ongoing responsibilities to the person who had bought the set. That philosophy, that a product should be designed for maintenance, that a skilled tradesperson should be able to service it, that the manufacturer owed the customer ongoing support, is as foreign to the modern electronics industry as the tube tester at the drugstore. We didn't lose the repairman only because the technology changed. We lost him because the philosophy changed, and the technology simply made it easy to forget what we'd given up. The TV repairman isn't entirely gone. He's just become something different, serving a smaller and stranger clientele. The one shop from a 1960s-era directory that managed to survive into the present did so by expanding dramatically, repairing not just televisions but computers, video equipment, professional and home audio, and eventually even automobile key fobs, following the live current of repairable electronics wherever it still flowed. A quieter revival has emerged around vintage electronics. The same audiophile impulse that brought back vinyl records has brought back the old tube amplifiers and receivers that go with them, and the technician who knows how to service a 1960s Marantz receiver or rebuild the capacitors in a vintage Fisher tuner can charge handsomely for that knowledge. The skills the TV repairman carried in his black case did not disappear when the shops closed. They retreated into a smaller world of collectors and enthusiasts who still believe, against the prevailing economic logic of the age, that a well-made thing is worth fixing. There was a time when the television in your living room was expected to break. And when it did, a man came to your house and fixed it on the carpet in front of you. He came because the television was built to be fixed, built with accessible tubes and ventilated panels, and separated high-voltage sections by manufacturers who held annual meetings to train the people who serviced their products, because they understood that the sale was the beginning of a relationship, not the end of their responsibility. He came because every gas station and drugstore and hardware store in town had a tube tester bolted to the counter, because 10-year-olds were expected to troubleshoot their own family sets, because repair was so normal it was simply called Tuesday. Then the transistor made the tubes unnecessary, and the integrated circuit made diagnosis by eye impossible, and the Japanese manufacturers made a new set cheaper than an old one was worth fixing, and the flat-screen panel made the entire interior of the product inaccessible to human hands, and the man with the black case simply ran out of reasons to come. We didn't lose the television. We gained better ones,
thinner ones, brighter ones that do things no two-base console could ever have imagined. What we lost was the understanding, built into the product itself, that something worth owning is worth repairing, and that a skilled person in your living room making something broken work again was worth every penny of $4.75. If you remember the warmth off the back of the cabinet, the glow of the tubes, the man kneeling on your carpet with his case open, you remember a different philosophy about what we owe the things we own. Subscribe, because there's another forgotten story already warming up.